despite how many times Jordan Peterson tells us
Marxism equals Leninism equals Stalinism equals communism, all the same thing. So worker vote, one worker vote is worth lots of peasant votes. There's this argument that World War II saves the Soviet Union.
if you take the socialism to the very left, it will always be totalitarian.
And Lenin's like, well, come on, don't be silly.
Please take me back to Russia in 1916 in terms of socially and economically. What was the situation like?
Yeah, 1916 is really hard to separate. I think 1916 in Russia from the fact that Russia is at war. And I mean, World War I being the kind of, this is a total war, right? And it's the way that it's described as a total war, and it's described as a total war because for the countries involved, for most of them, if not all of them, their entire domestic situation becomes reoriented toward war as well. And I think Russia's no exception. And so I thought a little bit about this question in terms of the way that I teach 1916. And one of the big issues, I think, for the regime is that the Tsarist regime itself has such a deep distrust of private initiative and citizens' initiatives that one of the things I think really worked against the Tsarist army was the refusal to openly accept and to expand the degree to which civilians, investors, Russian entrepreneurs had been participating in the war effort. And they sort of undermine that participation, and by doing that, undermine themselves and end up, I think, more and more isolated in terms of support from just about every part of the population. And so even the people you think who would have supported a traditional monarchy no longer supported a traditional monarchy.
Because of the war specifically.
The war, I think things were going in that direction. To my mind, the First World War determines the timing of the revolution, but what if history is not something I like to do? So in a sense, like, well, if there had been no First World War, would there have been a Russian Revolution? I don't know, right? But that's certainly the timing of the Russian Revolution. The war is a very important part of the timing.
Okay. And then when we go outside of Russia to the world, what stage socialism that came to Russia but the revolution happened in 1917. What's the state of the socialism was like in the rest of the world?
Yeah, and I didn't answer the second part of your first question, which maybe I'll talk about and then flip to the question of international socialism, because you were asking what was happening socially at home. Yes,
correct.
And the way I just was looking over this for my Imperial Russia class, and the way that I talk about 1917 and 1905 in terms of the revolution is that it wasn't one revolution. There were many, many revolutions. And what strikes me about Russia socially is fragmentation, that this is a society that there's so many different groups that have dreams and goals for the future, but they're not the same dreams and goals. So if you look at what the peasantry wants in terms of political change, it's not the same as what the working class wants. It's not the same as what the Cadet Party wants, not the same as what the Socialist Revolutionaries want necessarily, although their alignment with the peasantry is fairly good for the majority of the party, not necessarily the far radical terrorist wing. It's not the same, though, as what the Bolsheviks want or the Mensheviks or constitutionalists. And so it's so divided in my mind that is going to be a massive problem for the new regime going forward.
And the whole division, the monarchy couldn't come up with the key to connect all these little pieces and fragments.
No, I don't think they could. And I think that the decisions that they had been making through the course of the 19th century backs them into a corner, that they're further and further isolated from the population. So, for example, well, I mean, in some ways, it's kind of tragic that the ultimate reforming czar is assassinated, right? So Alexander II is assassinated. And what happens then is that his successors, his son and his grandson, think, well, this is what happens when you try to reform. Everything gets out of control, right? Again, what if? I don't know. If they had been reformers, if they had continued on a path of reform, if they had been able to move toward constitutionalism, could there have been a softer transition? Maybe. So that's, I think, some of the mistakes are the sort of reactionary response to the death of Alexander II, although I absolutely understand why they responded that way. To the question of international socialism.
International, at what point? Because you just said it, right? The multiple fragments, and that's very interesting for me, because I never thought that the whole country was divided into multiple little fragments. So what point was socialism in the world? And then I think a follow-up question to that will be why it was able to connect all these fragments.
And I think that's a really good question too, because when we talk about, also in terms of fragmentation, I haven't even started to talk about national identity, ethnicity, religious, because as you know, right, this country has so many languages, so many faiths, that's another, and it's so regionally diverse that all of those are also reasons for fragmentation, and for the fact that it's difficult to unite this country for a common goal. And I don't think that can happen until World War II. I mean, in some ways, there's this argument that World War II saves the Soviet Union because 27 million people, 25 million, it's hard again. We don't have specific numbers, right? But that it's that many million people had to die for something, right? And I think that gives socialism or the Soviet identity a new kind of lease on life that had been almost exhausted by the purges before the Second World War. But that doesn't answer the question about international socialism, which is, I don't know a lot of details about the socialist movements in other countries. I know in 1918, there's a fairly serious socialist revolution in Germany, so that there are, and we know that Marx and Engels had, wide communities of socialists. We know that the Russian socialists had been in touch with them. We know that Marx kicked Bakunin out of the Communist Party meetings in London. So, I mean, the Russians are certainly connected to the international socialist movement. A lot of Russian revolutionaries, a lot of the Russian political parties were formed abroad because political parties weren't legal until 1905, right? So I think that the Russian revolutionaries are connected to international socialism, but socialism is also fragmented, right? So you've got Bolsheviks, you've got Mensheviks, you've got left SRs, you've got SRs, you've got the Bund. So you have all these different socialist groups.
Was there the same ideology that's another question that I kind of have, is that you're saying that they're very fragmented, right? Even the socialism as well.
Yeah.
So what's then kind of the definition? That's what's the idea if it's so fragmented, what the idea that got to Russia?
Right.
And were there any other ideas of the socialism that didn't?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think I always react against the kind of blanket statement that socialism in Russia is just borrowed from the West and imposed on this country that didn't have, these socialist tendencies, and which makes absolutely no sense to me, because I think the socialist revolutionaries in many ways are a very Russian party. Like, their socialism is oriented around the countryside and it's oriented around the peasantry. And Herzen has a concept of Russian socialism that he talks about. I think someone like Tukachev, I think Lenin borrows this idea of a revolutionary vanguard from Tukachev. So to my mind, there's, of course, Marx and Engels are Western. Of course, Bolsheviks and Mensheviks consider themselves Marxists and borrow from Marx and Engels. But at the same time, I think that all the socialisms in Russia are very informed by Russian intellectual thought, Russian intellectual tradition, and Russian conditions.
So it's kind of like its own. That's what you...
To my mind, yes.
And what's the fundamental idea of the Russian socialism then?
And it depends who you talk to, right?
So if I talk to you.
If you talk to me, well, it depends on which of the revolutionaries you talk to, right? So if you talk to the socialist revolutionaries, right, their socialism contains, to my mind, many aspects of Slavophilism, and not in the sort of ultra-nationalist sense, but in the sense of looking to the peasantry for hope for the future. So this idea, so Slavophiles looked at the peasant commune and said, there's a source for like unity and for harmony and a kind of more mystical idea about what the Russian peasant commune could do, right? But the socialist revolutionaries, being like sort of leftists, being secular by and large, they look to it and say, no, well, this, we can skip all those the sort of most oppressive phases of socialism, of Marxism. We can skip them because we can use the Russian peasant commune as the center for communism, as the core, right? And this is a majority peasant country. So if we want to liberate this country, we want to liberate the peasantry. So if you talk to the socialist revolutionaries, their history goes way back to way back. It goes back to the populists in the 1870s, but back to the Slavophiles too, I think, right? And those experiences. So if you get one view from them. If you talk to, left SRs, they're like, we're direct action anarchists. Like, that's how we're going to bring this regime down. It's very different. If you talk to Mensheviks, they're going to be much more, well, look, we're Orthodox Marxists, and we don't think that you can skip the phases that Marx outlined, right? So that Russia does need to go through a bourgeois revolution. Russia does need for the proletariat to be exploited to the point where they come to their own consciousness, right? Because if you're sort of an Orthodox Marxist, you believe that consciousness comes before revolution, right? The revolution comes out of your awareness of your exploitation, your sense of your class for yourself and in yourself and for yourself, right? And the change that the Bolsheviks make, the change that Lenin introduces, is he's like, look, no, you Mensheviks, you'll only get as far as trade union consciousness, right? So if you have, like, the workers will be bought out by the trade unions, that'll be enough for them. They'll settle for sort of basic rights and, sort of what happens in the West, right? And he's like, what you need is a disciplined, small, focused, elite vanguard. And that vanguard has to fight for the revolution. And so for Lenin, revolution first, consciousness later, because we need the revolution now.
Let's say if we could name, I know it's completely unfair, but if we could name 5 main leaders, main figures who are leading the revolution, who are we at this point, 1917?
Okay, so it depends, again, like what part of 1917. So, in
Let's
February...
Say, I'm talking more about closer, February, February, yeah.
So in February, I mean, Kerensky is incredibly important. And what's interesting about Kerensky, he's the only person who is in both the Petrograd Soviet and the Provisional Government. Mm-hmm. So he's very powerful between February and October. Lenin comes back. So Lenin comes back in April, right? So there's the April thesis, and Lenin's the one who says we're not cooperating with the Provisional Government. Trotsky, obviously, because Trotsky's going to come in and organize the Red Army after October. Zinoviev and Kamenev I'd probably name as 2 more, because they are against October. They're against the idea of any kind of coup. They think that the country's not ready, and they in fact leak plans to the press, and they are, like, Lenin has them pushed out of the party. They come back in.
Okay.
But so what's interesting about Lenin, Zinoviev and Kamenev is that they show you the degree to which the Bolsheviks, as disciplined as they want to be, and maybe more disciplined than others, there's divisions among them as well.
And what was the main idea? So we have, like, let's say you, and that's great, actually, you named 5 people and 2 were more on opposing side. Mm-hmm. I'm interested, what was the idea while pushing the revolution, right? What was in their mind? Were they considering themselves as someone who will bring Russia to a greater place in a geopolitical overall world, or were they like, oh, we're gonna release all the peasants, and we're more gonna lift them up, in terms of, like, yes, you said, consciousness and stuff. Right. What was the motivation to doing that?
Again, a really good question. And again, I don't think that I think the Bolsheviks are more united than other groups simply because that's part of their identity, like discipline and a united front. And even though, like, there's some splintering between 1917 and 1921. In 1921, Lenin bans factions, right? He's like, we can argue behind closed doors, but we can never not present a united front, right? Post 1921. But it's so in a sense of what are the Bolsheviks thinking about the future of Russia? Again, I don't think it's a united vision. I think there's a commitment to revolution. There's a commitment to Leninism, right? To Lenin's view of this disciplined vanguard. I think many of them were still internationalists. Many of them believed that if there wasn't an international revolution, then the Russian Revolution would fail, right? So there's this sense too that, and it's slow in coming. Probably you see it most in Lenin, and Stalin's the one who develops the idea of socialism in one country. And that's where he ends. I mean, he has conflict with Trotsky right from the Civil War, because Trotsky is just like, get this guy off my battlefield. You know, like, he's just not doing what I tell him to do. He's not cooperating with Tsarist military officials. And Stalin's like, I'm not going to cooperate with them. And Trotsky's like, you have to. They're the ones who know military strategy, right? So right from the beginning, both Lenin and Trotsky are pretty pragmatic about like how they're actually militarily going to make these changes. But in terms of even visions of revolution, I think a lot of Bolsheviks would have had serious doubts about the future of socialism without an international revolution. So what's their goal? I mean, I think their goal at base was this kind of communist utopia, right? This egalitarian future where you didn't need militaries and you didn't need laws and you didn't need states and you didn't need governments, right? And very quickly that becomes clear to everyone that there's no way you can rule a country, which is what they end up doing, without a military and without a state, and their bureaucracy takes off. And that's what Trotsky's argument is, that Stalin is the incarnation of the bureaucracy.
And when they realized that?
Trotsky probably starts thinking that he's exiled in 27. He's kicked out of the party in 27. He writes about that in the 30s. So he writes The Revolution Betrayed, where he articulates this idea, right? Because as a Marxist, he can't say like Stalin just came as an individual and hijacked everything, right? As a Marxist historian, this is about social forces. So for him, when he tries to work out what went wrong, for him, it was that the country becomes bureaucratized and that Stalin is kind of the embodiment of that bureaucracy and this kind of petty bureaucratic mindset.
Everything that you described so far sounds to me like a working, not really democratic, but a working political process. You have multiple parties disagreeing, multiple combat for power. Right. You have people with different views. As you outlined, a building of a communism, we have a total goal, but people think that we can get there through multiple ways.
Right. There's a kind of pluralism.
Exactly.
Yeah.
How it all end up with a cult of one person and a perception of Soviet Russia, USSR as this monolith of a one person, of one idea, and that everything, like that all decisions are made by one person, pretty much. Right. Same as we have right now. Yes.
I think that's a really great, it's a great question. And I think that the answer is a really complex one, because so much feeds into that. The emergence of the Stalinist system was what we're talking about in the Soviet context. I think the Civil War plays a huge role. So Lenin, if you read Lenin's his analysis of the elections to the Constituent Assembly, it's a really interesting piece, and he says basically like, well, okay, so we didn't win in absolute numbers, but if you look at the way the voting played out, you look at the major urban centers, we won the majority of worker votes. Workers are more conscious than peasants. So basically, he doesn't literally say it, but he kind of basically the math boils down to, so one worker vote is worth lots of peasant votes. So in actual fact, we kind of did win. So we can just shut down the Constituent Assembly.
That's not really equality, though.
No, not at all, right?
Yeah,
so what I'm saying is,
you have some citizens who are more equal than others.
Exactly,
okay.
Exactly, and that's a kind of Marxist bias, right? This is an anti-peasant bias, which is what Lenin had. Right, he had a very profound anti-peasant. He calls them petty bourgeois vacillator. It's like we can't trust them. They might be communists. They might be, one day they might be socialists. The next day they might be liberal. The next day they might be monarchists. Who knows, right? So I think, and Lenin basically in that piece also says we kind of need a civil war because we need to push this population to choose. What do you want, red or white, right? And the civil war is going to force people into that really harsh dichotomy to choosing. So as a peasant, you're brutalized by the Red Army, you're brutalized by the White Army, but the White Army might take the land back. So who do you support ultimately, even if you reluctantly support them because they have brutalized you, right? And that's the course of the Civil War, is just brutality on all sides, and once again, it's the population that suffers and the population that pays, right? But Lenin wanted this choice to be very clear cut. And so then also during the course of the Civil War, there is dissent within the party itself. And so within the party, you have people like Alexander Kolontai and Mikhail Tomsky who say to Lenin, they're like, this is not socialism. And they create the workers' opposition. And they're like, you're exploiting the workers. Mm-hmm. Like we believed in a workers' revolution. We believed in liberating the workers. And now you are punishing them for absenteeism. There's all this discipline in the factories. What's going on? And what happened to, all power to the Soviets? And Lenin's like, well, come on, don't be silly, basically, right? He's like, no one can run a country like that, right? So these centralizing tendencies, you see them coming from Lenin already.
Okay.
Right? And then when the Civil War is... So in 1921, Red Kronstadt, so the Kronstadt sailors who had supported the Bolsheviks in October and had supported the Bolsheviks they were so pivotal in Bolshevik victory in many ways. They rebel against the Bolsheviks on the island of Kronstadt. And so they call in military, the Red Army goes in and brutally crushes that rebellion. But it's a wake-up call to Lenin because he's like, the ultimate Bolshevik constituency just turned against us. So we have to do something because now we've alienated the population. Mm-hmm. We've pushed them to the edge. So we need to and the idea of the new economic policy is this kind of coming back to some kind of normalcy, right? Where people can now, they can live their lives, they can farm, they can, so and within the party, there were people who were just you can't slaughter red sailors in Kronstadt, and so in 1921, Lenin does ban factions, right? Mm-hmm. So he may ease up on the economy, he may want to have a kind of rapprochement with the population, but he says to the Bolshevik party, this is centralized, right? Democratic centralism, right? We debate amongst ourselves, but we agree, Okay. And so there's already that tendency within the party. How does it get to the point, as you say, as a cult of personality? Lenin, there's an assassination attempt in 1918, right? So Lenin's badly injured. He has a series of strokes. By 1922, 23, he's fairly incapacitated. The person who's in charge of medical care is Stalin. Mm-hmm. Stalin keeps trying to keep information away from Lenin, has a massive conflict with Lenin's wife, with Krupskaya, because Krupskaya is bringing Lenin information. Lenin is angry with Stalin over a whole series of issues. In particular, Stalin crushes the Georgian Mensheviks, and Lenin accuses Stalin of great Russian chauvinism, right? Mm-hmm. So Lenin still, right? Lenin still, Lenin he made a wager, right, with sort of national revolutions across Russia, believing that national identity will be superseded by worker identity, but in the interim, encourage national revolutions because they're going to support a revolutionary cause more broadly. But, so he and Stalin are not getting along in these years. After Lenin dies, Stalin almost immediately goes about building a cult of Lenin. Right? Mm. So this is Stalin's tactic. It's too early to build a cult of Stalin, right? But he builds a cult of Lenin, even putting Lenin in the mausoleum. It's amazing that Lenin's just not spinning, the entire time, because that's the last thing he would have wanted was his body on view for the whole country, like an Orthodox relic. Yeah. Right? So where does this...
And he's doing that to centralize, to build a certain cult, because... At this point, was it a general consensus at this point that you need a centralized government to kind of lead the country forward?
That's a really good question as well. I mean, I think that there was already the custom within the party, although Lenin never wanted to say, I am the party's leader. He thought of himself as a party's leader, and they all thought of him as the party's leader. Right?
But they never agreed on that? That's what you're saying?
It was never explicit. Right? Okay. It was implicit. Right? But for Stalin, he carves out that role of himself as the party leader and pretty quickly starts to isolate and to eliminate opposition. I mean, not that there wasn't a tradition of that already, because by immediately after October, Lenin is quite happy to have leftist oppositionists arrested, exiled, or whatever. So it's not like this is just springs fully formed from Stalin's head, that Stalin's the totalitarian. It's a continuation. It's more intense under Stalin.
But you would say that Lenin kind of he built it, let's say. He set a trajectory, and then when Stalin came, he just accelerated the trajectory that he was already established. Is that fair?
I think that all of the different threads were there, and Stalin picked up the totalitarian thread in a sense. So Stalin picked up the more, I don't like the word totalitarian, authoritarian thread, let's say.
A lot of what we hear right now in the general media is that if you go to very extreme left, which that's what it sounded like, right? So, but for everything that you're describing, it's a kind of a working political system. But if you take the socialism to the very left, it will always be totalitarian, or that you don't like. It's more autocratic. Is that fair? I'm just trying to.
I know
because I'm trying to understand. Was there any other way?
Right, and that's also a really good question. I mean, this is a central debate in the historiography, right? And I don't want to sound like I'm in a camp that I'm not in terms of the historiography, but were there alternatives? I mean, this was the big, so in the 60s and 70s, so if we talk about historiography, right, this is more traditional historiography, and it's in the early stages, but to the present day, there are people who see it this way, that Marxism equals Leninism equals Stalinism equals communism, all the same thing, right? One line, one continuous development. As you say, that this is no doubt it's going to lead to authoritarianism, yes. Right? Then there's another view that was like, so now like Moshe Lewin and Stephen Cohen in their writings in the 70s, 80s, 68, Moshe Lewin's first book, their argument was that no, this is not the case at all, that Leninism is different from communism and Stalinism is different from Leninism, and that Stalin is the aberration here, that there were alternatives. And for Stephen Cohen, Bukharin was the big alternative. So he sees Bukharin as the champion of NEP, and that if you had pushed the new economic policy and continued to develop the new economic policy, and what Bukharin says was we need to ride the peasant nag into socialism, right? Mm-hmm. And Cohen is like, yeah, Bukharin was a viable alternative. Right.
And he represented in terms of a general, what did he represent in terms of direction?
Right. In terms of direction, he would have represented probably socialism with a human face. Right. So socialism that without the violence of Stalinism. Right. So without the purges, perhaps. Right. Without like that level of arrest. And again, it's what if history, though. Like we have no idea. Yeah. Moshe Lewin had a chapter in Lenin's last struggle. His last chapter is "What if Lenin had lived?" So if like he does create this whole what if scenario. Lenin doesn't live, right? Bukharin, so Stephen Kotkin comes along in the 90s, and he makes the argument. His book is called "Magnetic Mountain: Stalinism as a Civilization," and he argues that every civilization is born in violence. So Stalinism is no different. That Stalinism creates this new communist civilization. And you keep saying, well, what is it, right? What is this communist civilization? So if you push Kotkin to the wall, he's not capitalism.
Not capitalism.
Right.
Everything else, that's
what he said. Not capitalism.
Okay.
Right? Do I buy it?
Yeah, I just, a bit broad, that's what I would say. I don't know, it's like there's so many, like not so many alternatives, but...
Well, it's completely stripped down, right?
Yes,
it's
exactly.
Sort of like he's right against the wall, and the only thing he can say for sure is not capitalism, right? So in a way, that's kind of a response, though, to someone like Cohen, because it was like, if we continued to push NEP, the new economic policy, it would have ended up looking like capitalism, and that was not an option for these guys.
If you read more on an economy and what Soviets did, a lot of was, I believe, was class enemy, right? And that was a big idea of everything that they did. So everyone who occupied somewhat a prestige, high management, kind of CEO, CFOs levels of the companies and little businesses were basically kicked out, right? They like, you were a bourgeois, you can't be a part of a new man that we are kind of building. The question that I have here is that if you kick all these people out, who will be on their who will be instead of them.
So you're talking about Lenin in the 20s, basically, right?
Correct.
So or
correct.
Lenin and Bukharin.
Yes, I'm.
Yeah. So that is that's the issue, right? So Lenin, in terms of the new economic policy, right? What do we need to do? The Civil War has ripped the country apart, right? We've almost vanquished our enemies. We've sort of militarily vanquished our enemies, although we have peasant resistance, green revolution going on until 1924. We're still trying to deal with peasant unrest, right? And so in terms of, but the new economic policy is okay, what can we do to get people on side and to let people sort of live their lives again, right? So let's give up on sort of persecuting small scale entrepreneurs. So somebody that has a bakery and has 2 employees or a family, right? And they're just selling bread. Let them do it because we need it, right? We need food to be distributed. And then you have the netmen, right? So these were small traders who would just literally carry with them and start circulating goods around the country, right? So this is capitalism on a very small scale, right? So they do allow that. And you're right, though, by 1926, 27, they start to really tax those people. They really start to, Bukharin says, enrich yourselves to the peasants, right? And Stalin's like, what? What are you telling them? But by 26, they're taxing those so-called wealthy peasants very, very hard, right? So you're right. They're trying to push them out. Who's going to take over? So theoretically, what's going to take over is socialism, right?
As a system?
Yeah. Yeah, so that you're not going to have those petty bourgeois capitalist speculators who accumulate wealth. We don't like that, right?
Okay.
So, that's the sort of, so there's tension right from the beginning, though. There are Bolsheviks who don't like the new economic policy. For them, this is a very temporary, and Lenin says too, temporary retreat. But that temporary retreat for some Bolsheviks could be 25 years.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
But for others, like Stalin, who's just right from the beginning, he's I'm not cooperating with Tsarist officers. I'm not making deals with speculators. That there are parts of the party that are already hostile to this idea. Then you also get workers through the 1920s who are well, the peasants are holding us to ransom. There's a market outside of town and they're charging 3 times more than the state store, but there's nothing in the state store. So what's going on? So there's hostility toward the peasantry on the part of the workers, hostility toward the peasantry on the part of people within the party, right? So there are all of these tensions against, these petty traders or whatever, with peasants who are enriching themselves. It's on such a small scale that it's actually it's kind of awful, right, to think about it, because to think about who ends up getting persecuted under these grounds.
Yeah.
But I think that the motivation for the persecution is that we need to make a transition to socialism. New economic policy is a sellout to capitalism, and we need to do it quickly because, Stalin is there will be a war. Stalin is this country's not prepared for a war. There will be a war. The only way we can prepare for war is force the peasants onto collective farms, emphasize heavy industry, industrialize the country, and the population has to. Do you think
it was a general it was a general thought that there will be a war, or was it more a power grab? It's there will be a war, so let's do the way I say, because as you already point out before, he was all about centralized government, totalitarian cult. Let's follow me. I know what we're doing. Let's go here. And then it's a war. And some if we draw a parallel right now with what's currently happening in the world, it's a big thing. Even right now in Russia, is that the U.S. is right there. We have to follow me because if you don't follow me, there's U.S. and war is happening. So I'm your only leader. Yep. Seems very similar.
Yeah, and I think in 1927, there is what they call the war scare. And so there is this, due to a series of international events in China, events in Britain, there is this war scare and people start to hoard goods and it crosses the country. And then that also is used to the advantage of the centralizers, someone like Stalin and those who supported him. They use the war scare. They start to say, see, we have saboteurs in our midst. There are foreign engineers here. And then the Shakti trial takes place. So the first kind of tryout of show trials starts to take place. 1927, 28, it's early, right?
Yeah.
So all of these tendencies are already there. And these tendencies that are going to play themselves out in the mass arrests in 37, 38. But there's also through the 1930s, well, even starting earlier, you see it in the late 20s, there are all these sort of concerns that, the party has been infiltrated by people who aren't conscious, and we need to check party documents, and there's problems of abuse and drunkenness. And so there's all this internal suspicion, right, that I think becomes part of this general system of fear and violence.
Was it a paranoia, or was it like a tool to eradicate the class that we didn't like, or everyone who disagree with us?
Well, yeah, exactly. That's the thing too, right? Like, so you get this. We have to eliminate the kulaks as a class, right? What does that mean? It means absolutely. I mean, well, it means violence, because basically, who is a kulak? The definition becomes so elastic that it's anyone who opposes collectivization as a kulak, right? And then we have our justification to arrest them and brutalize them, imprison them. Some people are shot, not that many of them, but if you were arrested as a kulak in 1930, 31, you would good chance that you were rearrested in 37, and then the consequences were even more dire, right? So you may have served some prison time and come out after collectivization.
And it was all for the idea of what? That's one.
Yeah, the thing is, it's so tragic, right?
It is.
It's so tragic. And what was it for? I do think that there were still true believers, right? There were in a communist future, in an egalitarian future.
And that we have to just push right now and let's hold on and
sacrifice. And there's lots of people too. There were people who were just people who took advantage of it, right? So the volunteers who went out to collectivize, right? Some of them would go into a village and they would just start to cry. They're like, I can't do this, right? And they would identify with the people around them. They would try and soften the process. Others were like just thugs, right? They would go into a village and they would beat people and they would steal and they would rape. And, so a lot of it has to do with the individual in an individual moment, right? But at the same time, the regime does send these messages of overachieve, over-collectivize, right? And it's better to overachieve than to underachieve, right? And so the regime creates the circumstances where this kind of violence can occur. So I'm certainly not saying that the regime is blameless in any way. And they make no attempts until it suits their purpose to roll back the violence. And that's when Stalin says, oh, comrade, do you become dizzy with success, right? And in that is a very, very, it's a very deliberate move, because what it does is it redirects anger away from the state, away from the top, Stalin, and says, look, we're so sorry. Like the local officials, just like the local gentry were, they violated your rights. I didn't want them to. They were behaving in an illegal way.
And was that because a combination of the bringing pretty much the worst in people and then the regime that was built? Was it a part of people who built it, or was it a part of the ideology that dominated the overall? Was it set into the ideology that was brought, the socialism? Is it part of the socialism, or just like people built it in the wrong way, let's say?
Right. I don't think it's part of socialism. Like, I don't think it's an inherent part of left thinking at all. I think that that's kind of a weapon that's used against the left a lot. But I think what it is circumstance. I mean, it's sort of where the country was, where they wanted the country to be, and the fact that they were willing to do it in a very violent way. And that, I think, is what distinguished the Bolsheviks from some other groups, right? Was their willingness to use violence. And not that but the provisional government used violence too, right? Like in some ways, and so did the Tsarist regime, right? So this is a massive country. Your biggest resources are your peasants, right? Are grain, wheat, and how do you extract those resources? The Tsarist regime used violence. The provisional governments used violence. The Bolsheviks used violence.
Scales, though?
Well, certainly collectivization, is a completely different scale, right? Because this is a sense, too, of trying to, theoretically change the way people think and live. In actual fact, they don't, I think, change the way people think and live.
No?
I don't think so.
But do you think it's even possible? The idea, that's what always drove me completely crazy, to be honest, is that the idea that you can change a mindset of a 50-year-old man or woman. I can't change my dad's idea about education and hear you talking about the way you're going to live.
I agree. And I don't think that you should ever try to change someone's mind at the point of again, right? Because that's what they're doing. right? Because if you resist, then I'm going to use violence against you.
And that's just like because it's an extreme, is it a human thing? Is it a personality thing that people who got into, or is it more an umbrella term we're talking about here?
That's such a difficult question to answer. I mean, I think about it all the time as well, right? Like it drives me crazy too. Like, why does this happen, right? Why does extreme violence happen? I do think, and it was so interesting, I've taught for 3 years in the US, and I had taught in Canada before then. My Canadian students, when you make the argument, that you talk about something, like you look at Nazi Germany, right? And we're very sympathetic to Christopher Browning's argument, ordinary men, right? Anybody is capable, almost anybody is capable. Like 2% of people will say no, right at the beginning, to be like, no, you can't make me do this. Most people, though, can be coerced or pushed or cajoled or shamed into behaving in a very extreme way and in a violent way. Yeah. And they might regret it after, they might be ashamed of it at the time, but it depends on the situation that they're in. So like soldiers who commit atrocities, right? It's the situation that does it. And my Canadian students are very sympathetic to that argument. My American students were like, it shocked me because they were like, absolutely not. Americans could never do things like that. And I'm like, you guys, you have, right? Let's take some examples from Vietnam. And they're just like, no, that's just a complete anomaly, and that I thought was very revealing. Like to be convinced that you could not behave in this way is more dangerous in some ways. Yeah. And I think that most people, unfortunately, in the right circumstances and with the right manipulation, can behave violently.
So right now, in my bubble that I live, informational bubble that I live in, an idea of a socialism kind of coming back. When I saw that during even the U.S. Elections in 2016, it was a lot of we're not talking about new consciousness, you are oppressed, but I still hear that. I hear a lot of not oppressed by the government necessarily, oppressed by the capitalistic greed, oppressed by corporations. Every second comment on Facebook I read is, "Oh, those corporates."
Right.
Why do you?
So like the Occupy movement, things like that, right?
Exactly like that. Do you see that? Is that happening? And why is that happening? Why? Like I understand why people, for example, in Russia, in 1915. Would be against and would come to this idea because, hey, we have monarchy, like we have tsars and as you said yourself, consciousness, you are oppressed. Is it the same idea that we are oppressed right now? That's what's driving the kind of rise back?
Interesting question. Yeah. And it's funny because like as a historian, I'm always very tentative to like weigh in on contemporary issues. I like to wait like several decades for the dust to settle and collect my sources and then decide, which is probably not necessarily a great thing. But and it's interesting too, because I just taught a 4th-year seminar on the Russian Revolution 100 years later. So looking at all this material that came out in 2017, looking back at 1917. And so the last week that we did was looking at 3 articles in the South Atlantic Quarterly from 2017 that precisely wrestle with this issue. So these are left-thinking individuals who want to salvage the memory of October, right? And to sort of scrub the image of socialism to be exactly, as you say, relevant to the current situation, right? It all makes me nervous, right? Because I think that the kind of history that I'm interested in is a lot more to do with like how individuals experience whatever is sort of coming at them, right? So my first book is about the countryside in the 1920s and looking at how the state perceives an issue versus how the peasantry perceive the same issue and how they just never gonna meet in terms of even understanding time, right? That their concepts of time are completely different, right? And that this is like an irreparable, you can't fill this gap, right? So that's kind of what I'm interested in. So I'm always nervous about the people who were like, yes, we can create this international socialist movement based on And I'm like, well, how soon before you do pick up the gun, right? On each side. At the same time, I'm very, I don't like some of the thinkers who are like, oh, you think the problem is neo-fascism, it's neo-Bolshevism. Those guys are the evil ones. And that those ideological battles are just, I think that they're obscuring the reality.
But don't you think that people who say you think neo-nationalists, Nazis, like stuff like that, is a problem? Is because we got a pretty good vaccine shot from the far right ideology, from all the concentration camps and all the literature we have. That's what happens if you push it to very far right.
Right.
But when it comes to far left, we didn't really get it here. Like, not so many. I'm not sure how many people in this room know about gulags,
right?
Or how much. Do you think that might be the problem, just because we just don't know? And people who say something like that, it's like, oh, I'm aware that you know about Nazis,
right?
But I'm not sure aware if you know what happened when Stalin was in power.
Right. I mean, I think you're right that people know more in general about the Holocaust than they do about Stalinism. At the same time, you may be overestimating how much people know about the Holocaust even, right? Because if we look at events in the US, right, that you have, or even look in Russia, right? Like when you have you have people doing the Nazi salute in Russia, and you're just like, your grandfather died at the hands of the Nazis. Like, how can you do this? And a lot of it has to do with not knowing, right? So that's one of the things that worry me, right? That people aren't necessarily thinking through. People are just reacting, both on the left and the right. We're talking about, I think you sort of suggested that there's people who are saying, oh, I'm oppressed, the corporates, and you're like, oh, come on, your life's pretty good.
Exactly.
Right? But I don't think, those aren't the people I'm so worried about. No? I think that.
Who are you worried about then?
I'm worried more about people who live on the edge of subsistence and who are the first ones that climate change, and they are already being ravaged by climate change, right? So I'm worried much more about mass poor populations, looking at countries like India, right? Looking at places in Africa where there is somewhere like Yemen, right? Where there is intense suffering already. And that suffering's just going to intensify. And as that suffering intensifies, we're just going to circle the wagons and protect ourselves. And I kind of worry about the violence that might
more than
portend.
Here, you think it's more like a in this country. You think, despite what some people say, and let's say, for example, despite how many times Jordan Peterson tells us that they're coming after you, think it's more noise than the actual reality.
Absolutely. I also think we should be quite willing to give up some of what we have. We have too much, right? And that's what we should be telling people, not like, oh, build walls and protect yourselves. It's like, no, drop the walls and help other people, right? Because that's the only way we're going to fix this. It's probably too late. I don't think we're going to fix it, but...
We're going to pieces, that's it.
We're just going down.
Oh, lovely, lovely. That's it.
Should we end on that note?
Yeah, I think we should.